Hello, good evening, and welcome to another LAMFcast presentation, a very special presentation by the Lakes Area Music Festival, hosted by yours truly, Garrett McQueen. Whether you're with me here live or taking a look at this presentation at a later date, it's an honor to have you along with me here. Be sure to put any questions or any comments you may have along the way in the chat or by using the Q&A feature. And if any come up, I'll reserve a little time toward the end of this presentation to engage you to do my best to answer any questions you may have. I want to send a special shout out to Scott and Taylor from the Lakes Area Music Festival leadership team for inviting me to continue with these presentations, and a special shout out to Claire Gunsberry, who's been working behind the scenes to make sure all of our technology is in the right place, to make sure that you can hear me and the music that I have to offer, and just to make sure that everything is running smoothly along the way. So special thank you and shout out to Claire. But most importantly, thanks again goes to you for your continued support, not only of the Lakes Area Music Festival, but of all of the live art that you help make possible in your communities and around the world. All Lakes Area Music Festival activities, including this one, are made possible by the voters of Minnesota through grants from the Five Wings Arts Council and Minnesota State Arts Board through a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Garrett. I'm a bassoonist, first and foremost. I spent about a decade making a living on stage as an orchestral musician, and since 2016, I focused my energy on arts activism and arts advocacy so that orchestral spaces can continue to survive and continue to thrive in our ever-changing and ever-evolving world. I'm actually going to talk about some of my peripheral work, specifically as it relates to new music, later on in this presentation. But just for context, my work in other ways has crossed a number of fields and industries, including public and commercial radio, digital and broadcast media, podcasting, institutional collaborations, and live lectures and presentations like this one. So it's really an honor for me to get to share my passion and to support the Lakes Area Music Festival in this way. So today I'm presenting information on the concert Santos and Haydn. It takes place on August 17th here in a few weeks at 7:30 p.m. at the Geechee Zeebe Center for the Arts in Brainerd. Tickets for this upcoming concert on August 17th are available online. You can name your price and reserve your tickets at lakesareamusic.org. So as always, at least as far as my presentations here are concerned, I like to begin with an Indigenous land and art acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements have become the norm in many spaces these days, especially in art spaces, and that's a great thing, yes, but we have to be sure to always think about the next steps, going beyond just the acknowledgement, but also the celebration. So, how can we honor those who came before us and their living descendants who are here today most equitably, especially from that arts perspective? Well, for me, one of those answers is by honoring their music or their musicking, as I've been taught by several indigenous artists and musicians. And we're going to do a little bit of that today. But first and foremost, I'm calling in today from my home, which sits on the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe and Wapakuti Sioux. People who may not be as familiar with the ancestral connection to this part of the world may know where I live as the west side of St. Paul, just across the river from downtown St. Paul. It's a place that I've grown to really love, and I'm very proud to call this part of Minnesota home. I honor this space, the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe and Wapakuti Sioux, as their land, and I'll continue to do everything I can to inspire conversation of Indigenous equity, repatriation, and liberation. I hope that you can do your own work in that regard by starting with understanding the land on which you live. You can find more information on that at native-lands.ca. So, as you may have noticed on the Lakes Area website, or if you've been joining me for these presentations these past few weeks, you may remember that the overall theme for this Lakes Area Music Festival season is Worlds Connect. This is something that's apparent in many ways when we think about connectivity between ourselves, our communities, and the rest of the world. From nature, it's affirmed there. It's affirmed through practices like Nichiren Buddhism, which I participate, and even in things as simple as just saying hello to a neighbor. That interconnectedness of all things is important to note and really important to engage. And that's what everyone over the Lakes Area Music Festival are hoping that you can think about when it comes to these programs and to these concerts. Now, all of that to say, before you and I dive into the program for this August 17th concert, I'd like to connect you with one of the indigenous communities that I have a connection to. Worlds connect in that sort of way. So way out west, where it's a bit warmer than it is here on the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Wapakudi Sioux, you have the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Lipan Apache and Mescalero Apache. It's an area that's since been renamed and recognized as Alamogordo, New Mexico. So in that region, I actually have a bit of family, and after attending a family wedding this past weekend where a lot of folks came down to Memphis from out of town, I've been thinking about that concept of worlds connect in that unique way. In my case, black and indigenous cultures coming together to celebrate lifelong love. And congratulations to my cousin Daria and her now husband Reynaldo on your recent nuptials. Well, there are a number of indigenous, even Apache artists from that part of the country and who call that part of the country home. And they're doing something similar with their gift of music, connecting worlds and bringing worlds together. And one of those folks, Me Gestelum, established himself as an integral member of the Afrobeat and soul music scenes in New York City, all while celebrating his own indigenous heritage as a musician. He's been at it for several decades now, and his music has continued to spread across the country and around the world ever since. So, in the spirit of Worlds Connect, and to offer something beyond just the acknowledgement of land, I've prepared a short excerpt for you so that you can get a taste of how Cochime Gastelum gets down musically. This is from a performance back in 2019 featuring Cochime and his band performing a work that honors all of those things: the soul, the blues, the black music, and his indigenous roots. An excerpt here from a work of his called Mescalero. Take a listen. excerpt there from Mescalero by Cocheme Gastelum. That's, of course, one very specific example of how worlds connect and how we all can engage that concept in our own ways by honoring our fellow humans. But I hope that you'll think about that in your own life. This concept of worlds connect personally as we connect that concept to this upcoming, not October, August 17th concert by the Lakes Area Music Festival. So that concept and general theme of Worlds Connect is actually a really great way to offer some context for this upcoming concert. The music of Franz Joseph Haydn, Dimitri Shostakovich, and Isaac Santos may not seem to be so connected on the surface level, but one of my goals today is to help you see some of the interconnectedness that I see in this program. It's a really exciting collection of works that I can't wait for you to experience live and in person up in Brainerd. We have a new work on the concert by a living composer, Isaac Santos, which connects to the idea of the creation of new work and new ideas as realized by Dimitri Shostakovich, a little connectivity there. And then going even further back into history, we have the 18th century's own Franz Joseph Haydn, whose chamber and symphonic works inspired the structure that not only Shostakovich worked within to a degree, but the structure that many other composers have used as a springboard for understanding and education and codifying their own voices as composers. So just a sample there of what I'll be diving into today when we think about the connectivity between these three composers and their seemingly very different approaches, but how it can still be, how many connections can still be drawn between them. So on the screen here is a sort of wax reenactment of Franz Joseph Haydn. He was born way back in the 1700s, back in 1732. So obviously there are no photographs, but I think it's kind of fun to see those sorts of depictions just to offer a bit more humanity to these historic figures in Western classical music. Haydn grew up to become known both in his time and throughout history as the father of the string quartet. He wrote many of them and helped codify that sort of arrangement in a way that we still see today, even in contemporary string quartets. You'll also see Franz Joseph Haydn every now and again referred to as the father of the symphony because, quite frankly, he wrote a lot of them, more than most composers, almost all Western classical composers did. It's his final symphony, his symphony number 104, that's on the program for this August 17th concert, his 1795 symphony number 104. I'll tell you a little bit about it and offer a sample of that symphony for you here shortly. But I wanted to make sure that you have the opportunity to get a taste of his unique approach to chamber music specifically. Now, again, it's interesting that this work and this composer falls under the season theme of Worlds Connect because as connected to the Western classical genre as Haydn is and was, much of his output was actually born on the opposite end of that spectrum of connectivity. He was very unconnected from the rest of the world for many years of his life. You have to understand that Haydn, like many composers of his day, worked as a court musician. This isolated him from other musical happenings of the world because he was busy tending to the Esterhazy family, and they were very demanding of him and the rest of the staff that supported the family and the estate. They paid him to live and thrive as a composer, so it wasn't a downtrodden sort of relationship, but definitely one of servitude. So it was just a little hard for him to keep his ear to the ground, so to speak, when his entire life and musical output, at least at that time, centered around a single family. This is something that he himself recognized. You can find a quote from Haydn out there where he basically says that the relative isolation that he experienced as a composer at that point in his life forced him to be original. He didn't have other people to play off of or other musical things in his ears to collaborate on And maybe that can be considered one of the primary reasons why we still talk about Haydn today, the connectedness that his unconnectedness or disconnectedness inspired over history. One of the really unique things about Haydn is that when he was working for the Esterhazy family, he not only had to write music that they liked and would enjoy and could listen to over dinner or whatever they were doing, he had to write music that the family, members of the family, could actually play. So around 1765, Prince Nicholas of the family was learning to play an instrument called the baryton. It's not the baritone, the brass instrument that we think of today, the euphonium. It's a stringed instrument called the baryton. You can see it depicted there to the left of your screen. I don't think I've ever seen a baryton in real life, and maybe Haydn hadn't either the first time he had to write for the instrument, but he did indeed write for it. And thanks to that unique job and that unique opinion, there are over 200 pieces of music that utilize the baryton. Now, of those works, 120 are remembered as baryton trios, so music for the baryton as pictured there, along with the viola and the cello. So instead of revisiting his well-loved string quartets, I'll give you a taste of Haydn's approach to chamber music by sharing one of those baryton trios. This is actually the finale, a couple minutes of Haydn's 55th baryton trio. This performance of it features Matthew Baker playing the baryton with violist Esteban Dalmeida Reese and cellist Alex Friedhoff. So as you could hear, the baryton is relatively quiet. I'm not an expert in that particular style of music, but I would imagine that the instrument's relatively soft nature is why it was eventually phased out of the so-called mainstream of Western classical music, similar to instruments like the clavichord, which is also relatively quiet in comparison to other instruments. I think it's also interesting from that excerpt that we heard and what you can hear in many of his baryton trios is that Haydn had the sort of intelligence to write for individuals and for the moment in time. So it wasn't the baryton that took the lead in that music. It was actually the viola. I imagine that this had to have been the case because Prince Nicholas himself couldn't have been as skilled as the professionals in the court, but Haydn didn't want to leave him out or make him feel like a lesser musician. So his intelligence as a composer is inherent in many ways when listening to that relatively obscure chamber music by Franz Joseph Haydn. But it wasn't just the soft instruments and the chamber music that Haydn wrote, of course. As I mentioned earlier, Haydn wrote a whopping 104 symphonies. And what's unique about them, many of them at least in the Western classical catalog, especially for the time, is that many of them were given nicknames based on some of the oral aspects of the piece. So, for example, His penultimate symphony, his 103rd symphony, is known as the Drum Roll Symphony. So you can guess and imagine which instrument gets a prominent role there, right? He also has his Miracle Symphony, the Clock Symphony that ticks really beautifully in the inner movements. And he even has symphonies named after animals. His 82nd symphony is known as the Bear Symphony, and the one that followed, his 83rd symphony, was nicknamed the Hen Symphony. So I definitely encourage you, if you're interested in that big C classical aesthetic, to check out some of those named symphonies, just to hear Haydn's connection to the world. Worlds connect in that way once he really got his footing as a symphonic composer. Well, among his more famous named symphonies is his 95th symphony, written in 1791. It's called the Surprise Symphony. And if for some reason you've never had a chance to hear why it's called that, I've excerpted that section, a section that gives that helps people understand why the work has that title. I won't even say anything. We'll just listen to Leonard Bernstein and the Vienna Philharmonic offer a bit of the opening to the second movement of Haydn's Surprise Symphony, his symphony number 95. So I'll tell you, I've played many concerts where those big hits gets a real reaction out of the audience. So if you have a reaction to it, maybe if you were, I don't know, resting your eyes a little bit and you get jostled in the middle of that second movement, no worries. That second movement has been jostling audiences for hundreds of years. So worlds connect through the audience experience in that way. I hope you do get the experience of hearing that live and in person. But on the August 17th concert, it is the final and 104th symphony of Franz Joseph Haydn that's going to be showcased. It's nicknamed the London Symphony. So Haydn didn't spend his entire life serving the Esterhazy family. He did indeed find his own way eventually, all the way over to London. That's where he wrote his final 12 symphonies, actually. Technically, each of those 12 symphonies, they're all known as the London Symphonies, but it's that final one that most folks think of when you say Haydn's London Symphony, his symphony number 104. I've included a quote there on the screen from Haydn's personal diary after the premiere performance of his 104th Symphony in London back in 1795. He wrote, "The whole company was thoroughly pleased, and so was I. I made 4,000 gulden on this evening, such a thing as possible only in England." I did a little research, and it looks like 4,000 gulden would have been about $2,300 today. So not a horrible commission fee, if you ask me. As is the case with many composers' final symphonies, there's a lot of culmination in this music. When you hear it on the August 17th concert, I think you'll really hear that, especially in the finale, how many of Haydn's aspects culminated in many different ways in this final symphony. You hear some of the humor in this symphony, just as we heard it in that surprise symphony. You have that very traditional Western classical aesthetic pushed to the front, but you also have lots of energy. Haydn really passed the torch by making sure the finale of this final symphony of his sounded final. But you don't have to take my word for it. I think you'll be able to hear all of those things, the dynamic shifts, the humor, and everything in between in the finale of his 104th Symphony. So here's just a little taste of that, the tail end of that finale, Movement 4 of Haydn Symphony 104, as performed here by the Norwegian Chamber Orchestra. So there's no mistaking when the end of the piece is. Very culminating, very final in his catalog, while still hinting at some of that humor, the louds and the softs, and everything that really made Haydn one of those most memorable of composers. I'll also mention that this final symphony has an orchestration that for the time was pretty innovative. Symphonies that would come much later, and different sorts of symphonic works, even music by Beethoven himself, wouldn't always utilize that type of orchestra. Haydn was also a contemporary of Mozart's, actually a bit more famous in his day than Mozart. And even Mozart didn't expand the orchestra all the time quite as Haydn did. So it's a really great example of music from the past that connects to what would later come and who would be inspired by what Haydn offered to music. So there's a lot that I could say, a lot more that I could say about Haydn's continued impact on Western classical music. He helped codify things like the symphonic form, the construction of the string quartet, more music history, sort of music theory things that you're probably interested in. But it's important just to understand to a degree, because as far as Western classical music is concerned, Haydn really did put a lot in place. So if Haydn is one of the first great symphonists or writer of symphonies, I think it's safe to consider the next composer on the program one of the last great symphonists. Certainly not the last, but I would say a composer who took all of these fancy words and structures and brought them not only into the 20th century, but created even more thematic and programmatic connections between audiences and the music that would help people really dive in and understand more of these aesthetics more than they had in the past. So yes, of course, I'm talking about the one and only Dimitri Shostakovich. So on July 20th, 1942, exactly 80 years ago today, as I'm speaking to you, Shostakovich made the cover of Time magazine, as you can see there. This was due in part to his unique relationship with politics. These days, there are a lot of people who tend to try and separate the political from the musical, but Shostakovich really leaned into that intersection. By making the cover of Time magazine, Shostakovich became a sort of symbol for the Soviet struggle against outsiders. At least that's the story that we were led to understand. If you know much about Shostakovich's life and his other political dealings, you might also know that he wasn't always celebrated at home. His music was deemed by Joseph Stalin as among many things as formalist or not really for the people. And after a really scathing review of one of his works in the Russian newspapers, Shostakovich found himself always watching his back. There were even stories about Shostakovich keeping a suitcase packed just in case the secret police came to take him away in the middle of the night. He didn't want to disturb his family. So it really was a serious situation for Shostakovich, considering the political implications that he engaged. Now, toward the end of his life, he stopped opposing at least openly, the Soviet regime and actually joined forces with them. Some say that this was a case of he couldn't beat them, so he joined them. Other people say other things, but I think what's important to note is that his life and his music, more often than not, had that political slant and that connectedness to the broader world and to broader society. What I'd say is his most famous work is, at least when it comes to his symphonies, is his Fifth Symphony. He used that same basic symphonic schematic as Haydn did hundreds of years earlier, but he used a more modern orchestra with more instruments to tell this more modern story. The opening of his Fifth Symphony is really dark and almost grimacing. It reminds me of an occupied Russian city where people are afraid to say or do what they really want. And I think that idea comes through in that first movement really beautifully. But what do you think people did once they were out of the eyesight of Big Brother, once they were behind closed doors? I would imagine that there was a lot of joking happening and sarcasm against the regime, all while keeping in mind what would happen if those words of sarcasm made it to the wrong ears. Well, Shostakovich paints that picture really beautifully in a musical way in the second movement of his Fifth Symphony. And I wanted to share a little bit of it just to give you an idea of what Shostakovich's more playful and sarcastic music sounded like, as mixed in with those very brooding back of your mind ideas about this oppressive Soviet regime. The opening here, the first couple minutes of the second movement of Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony is performed here by the Russian Philharmonic. So again, think of this as a depiction of that proverbial iron fist meeting what people may have been saying and thinking behind closed doors. So I wanted to take the time to offer that because, again, this idea of Russian oppression and celebration, making fun of and respecting, balancing these things play a really important part of the general aesthetic of the music of Shostakovich. Something to always keep in mind when you're listening to his music, even as it relates to the piano concerto that's on this concert. But I can't talk about piano music and Shostakovich without giving a little room to his second piano concerto. The first is on this concert, which I'll play a little bit for you shortly, but I want you to take a listen to how playful and youthful the opening of his second piano concerto is, just to reinforce that idea as it relates to the concerto form. Shostakovich actually wrote this piece of music for his son's birthday, so that plays a big role into the youthful nature of this piece, but it's just too fun of a piece for me not to share a little bit of with you today. So here's the opening of it, performed for you by Yuja Wang with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And for the sake of time, we'll end that there. But again, you can just really hear those mixing of moods, the menacing, the playful. Just such a one of the reasons why Shostakovich, in my opinion, is such an incredible composer and one of my personal favorites in the Western classical repertoire, if I may offer that. So on this concert, on the August 17th concert, is the first piano concerto of Shostakovich. It also features principal trumpet in a way that mirrors many of the things that I've been talking about, these mixing of moods and how it highlights his relationship and his feelings about the place and time and the place in the world that he existed. I wanted to offer the score here just so that you can hear actually an excerpt of a sort of family fueled performance of this piece. As you're listening to the many different moods of this, keep in mind who's playing it. This performance of it features the ensemble I Musici Montreal. Dimitri Shostakovich's son, Maxim Shostakovich, is actually conducting this recording, and Dimitri Shostakovich's grandson, who is named Dimitri Shostakovich Jr., is the solo pianist. So keep that in mind, that for sort of family proximity to the real story as you hear the mixing of moods and the jostling attitude of the opening of this first piano concerto of Dmitri Shostakovich. So think back to a time before social media and before it was acceptable to speak one's mind when it comes to life and even the government. That's still the case in many parts of the world, and that's the world that Dmitri Shostakovich lived in. So when I hear that music, I hear those dissonances. I hear those frustrations, and I really hear a connection to that part of history that we can really think about today and is fully alive and well through music. The first piano concerto by Shostakovich, also featuring trumpet, will be featured on the October 17th concert. But it's one of many just brilliant pieces of music by Dmitri Shostakovich. So maybe in preparation for the concert on your drive up to Brainerd, if you're not a local, be sure to check out some more of his music so that you can really become immersed into the general aesthetic of what is the music of Dmitri Shostakovich. So when it comes to new music, as it were, this was something that Shostakovich in his day was constantly fighting against, wanting to innovate and do something new while also pleasing the powers that be. Well, thankfully, we live in a world today, at least here in the United States, where largely composers, emerging composers, and young composers have an opportunity to really express themselves through music without fear of any sort of isolation or uncelebration of their music. I think about all of this when it comes to the final composer featured on this concert. Isaac Santos was born in the year 2000, so a youngster among us, and he's currently pursuing his bachelor's degree in music composition at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music and has many accolades to his name already. I mentioned in the introduction to this presentation that I'd speak a little bit more to some of my work. So, in addition to the many organizations I'm involved with and work with, I'm on the board for the American Composers Forum, which, if you don't know, is an organization built to support composers. Among those programs and initiatives by the American Composers Forum is an initiative called Next Notes. I had the great opportunity of leading Next Notes programming back in 2020, and the program is continuing to support composers, young composers from across the country and around the world. Just a little bit on Next Notes. It's a national program designed to nurture the next generation of creative voices and music inclusive of all styles. And Isaac Santos has been a recipient of Next Notes Awards. So as you're thinking about new music and young composers, keep the American Composers Forum in mind as a resource for young composers. And again, a huge shout out and thank you to the Lakes Area Music Festival for paying special attention to the need to platform new music in our orchestral spaces. So because Isaac is premiering a work on August 17th, I can't really give you a sample of it, but I selected two previously composed works by Isaac Santos just to give you an idea of the general aesthetic, how some of the music may remind you thematically of Haydn and some of the ways that he was connecting his music to the world, while other pieces of music might be a little crunchy, as we heard in that Shostakovich, even in title. So just a couple excerpts here of music by Isaac Santos. This first one is a movement called Boredom, the opening movement to a larger work of his called Rainy May Muses. So, in the same way that Franz Joseph Haydn was able to have works nicknamed based on the aesthetics that were inspired in people's mind by the music, I hear a lot of that here. I think it's really obvious why the idea of rain is put in connection with this music. And it's just a really beautiful example of how the next generation is also paying attention to more programmatically themed pieces of music. The second excerpt from Isaac Santos that I wanted to offer, as I mentioned, does have more of that crunchy sound. The work is even called Crunch Time. And if we want to compare this work to Shostakovich a little bit, I think the mixed meter plays a big role in the general jostliness, if that's a word, of the music, and just an aesthetic that keeps you constantly on the edge of your seat listening, and just to make sure you don't miss anything. So, again, a quick excerpt here from the catalog of Isaac Santos, a work here called Crunch Time. So, in the same way that I hope you can really appreciate the evolution of the general aesthetic of music from Haydn to Shostakovich, I hope that you can do the same thing here. I'm waiting on the edge of my seat, just like everyone else is, to see what Isaac comes up with for this August 17th concert. But it's sure to be a mix of everything that he's already put out there and an example of just how incredible he is as a young composer. In addition to being a recipient of the Next Notes Award from the American Composers Forum, Isaac Santos has the LAMF Composer Fellowship, and it offers this early career opportunity to present works to orchestras and audiences. So again, a huge thanks and shout out to the Lakes Area Music Festival for investing in and engaging with new music, and congratulations to Isaac Santos for kicking off what's sure to be a very successful career as a composer. So that's the music that's going to be featured on the August 17th concert in Brainerd by the Lakes Area Music Festival. It's, of course, a part of what is a very vibrant collection of works by composers living and non-living, and a great example of what the Lakes Area Music Festival continues to offer to audiences in Brainerd, across Minnesota, and with the help of digital technology around the world. Again, you can name your price for this August 17th concert by visiting lakesareamusic.org. My name is Garrett McQueen. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. Hope you enjoy the concert.